property taxation as we have today is one of the strictest and most violent forms of taxation that humanity has seen. Property taxation has been around, but it has not usually been based on the value of the property. In medieval England and Europe, property taxation was basically based on the rent that property was bringing in. The reason its property taxes should be based on rent is because you can't tax something that does not produce anything. A house in itself, a residential house, unless it's rented, it's not producing any income. So to tax a house which is not rented in itself, it's inhumane and it's a violation of economic laws and human rights, I would say. Now, if property will be taxed no matter what, then it should be based on the possible rent that property would bring if it was rented. Even if it's not being rented at that point and it's being inhabited by the owner, then it should be taxed based on the amount that it would get if it was rented. The taxation that we have today, that's based on valuation of the property, and they tax a percentage based on how much that property is worth, is a lot more than what the rent of that property would be, and then hence the taxation would be based off of that rent would be a lot less than when the taxation is based on the value of the property. And this is why they base the property tax on the value of the property and update the valuation of the property to constantly increase the taxes so they can get more and more money out of people. But if it was based on rent or the possible income from rent, if that property was rented, then the amount of property tax would be a lot less. The reason why property taxes should be based on rent and not the value of the property is because you cannot tax someone or something that's not producing anything. Capital, wages, profit is taxed because it has produced a value, it has produced certain amounts of money, or it has produced some certain amounts of produce. Let's say a land can be taxed either with money, or you can pay your taxes with the produce of that land. Let's say in China they used to tax certain lands not by money, but let's say in rice, or in Egypt they would charge them in grain, or some churches would give their land out to the tenants and then they would charge them with the produce of that land. Let's say so many bags of potatoes. But if that land is not producing anything, then you can't charge them anything because there is no production. This is the case with a house. There is no production in a residential house in itself. The only production that happens in a residential house is when it's rented. And that's why in economic terms, in the reasonable economic mindset of capitalism that we should have, it should be based on the possible amount of rent that property will bring. So the property tax should be a percentage of the rent that a certain house would bring in, and not the value of the house. The reason I'm talking about property taxation is I want to raise awareness, because it's very important to be aware of the fact that we're being enslaved day by day by the system, by this AI controlled system increasingly. If property is being taxed unreasonably high, at unreasonable high rates, you guys have to realize we're losing, first of all, our freedom to our property. we're being enslaved in constant payments and debt bondage. We're constantly owing money. We're treated basically worse than the slaves back in the day, the serfs that were actually in medieval times in 1700s England. People actually had more rights to their property than we have today now, because people were aware back then. They were aware of the fact that their rights are being violated. They used to fight to keep their freedoms and not be taxed unfairly. That's why we actually ended up having the the American Revolution, is because people in the plantations of England thought that they were being taxed unfairly by the English Empire. So they said no taxation because there is no representation of them in the English Parliament. Now England was thinking of giving them some type of a representation in the English Parliament, but that didn't come to happen because the people in the plantations of today's America, they decided they want to have a freer and fairer society where they control their destiny. Each state has their own rights, and they're now being unfairly taxed by some tyrannical central government. If property taxes were based on the services that each city needs, then every year or every 2 years they would have to update property taxes of each house based on the amount of money that each town needs for their needs. The property tax would not be based on the value of your house. It would be actually based on the amount of money that the city or the local municipality needs to operate. So every year your property tax would go up and down possibly, but usually it would be a lot lower than what it is now. You guys need to be aware that this is an ongoing problem that's taking our freedoms, our rights, our property rights, and they're violating those rights through economic violence against property owners. And this economic violence against property owners is happening not only through property taxes, but it's happening through rentalsman laws that are violating basic property rights of landowners, and they're leaning more towards taking as many rights as they can from people that are honestly trying to rent, let's say, a house, but due to government overbearance and regulations, a tenant can come in and stay in your house, not pay you rent for months, make you bankrupt, break your house, destroy it, and leave, and you have basically no recourse at that point. And by the time the courts come to your salvation, it's all late. This is the state that we have in Canada right now. Most people are oppressed economically, politically. Their freedoms are under constant oppression, especially since COVID in Canada. The amount of oppression that happened during COVID, during the extensive lockdown for absolutely almost no reason, the amount of oppression that happened, the amount of hurt that they gave to small businesses and regular people is unbelievable. And it's still happening because we have a lot of small businesses closing in Canada. A lot of people are struggling. They're going into debt, and that's the plan, is to put people into slavery, to put people into debt bondage, so you're always running on the treadmill and you can't get off the treadmill, and eventually they will own us through debt bondage. That bondage is something that was happening always in medieval Europe. That bondage means when they basically, what they do is they make your debts perpetual, so your debts never end, and that way you basically end up being a slave to the system. That bondage is happening today, where mortgage rates, house prices are artificially so high that people can't pay off their houses. Even if you pay off your houses, the constant rise in property taxes, constant rise in taxation always keeps you in debt, meaning you're always in debt bondage. You never get rid of debt. You always owe money to the government, to the system. We don't have true capitalism anymore, or we never had true capitalism. Although we strived for it, we pushed for it, but now we're further away from capitalism than we ever were. Because capitalism is free market. Capitalism is freedom of trade, economic freedom, political freedom. You can't have artificial government supported monopolies. You can't have artificial laws and regulations that favor banks and certain elites against majority of people who are being overtaxed, overregulated. That's not capitalism. Capitalism supposes true freedom and minimum regulation from any type of government. So true capitalism is minimum government, minimum regulations, minimum rules and laws, and it allows every person to independently operate its own matters, its own business, its own capital stock. And obviously, yes, as a productive member of a society, you will have to pay a reasonable amount of taxes to a reasonable government, but not this absurd and tyrannical authoritarian taxation that we have right now in Canada. It's not only taxation though, it's all aspects of our life. It's under oppression by rules and regulations, which is the basic definition of authoritarianism, is when the government is meddling in every aspect of our life, creating rules for every aspect of our life that we do. The way you go to school, where you take your kids, what your kids think, what their sex is supposed to be, who you rent your house to, how you rent your house to them. Every aspect of the Canadians' lives are being regulated by some type of rule from a central government. This is the definition of authoritarianism. So I want to spread awareness that it's a lot of people now are enjoying the snow, etc., whatever, buying toys and enjoying the temporary enjoyments of life. If you guys are not paying attention to your basic freedoms, to our basic freedoms that we're losing, sooner or later these enjoyments are going to be taken away once they take over us. And they are steadily taking over us in the West, in Europe. Obviously Europe is a tyranny. The European Union, it's an unelected, unrepresented body, and there's no democracy there, there's no republic there. It's a basic central government tyranny that's installed in Europe. And we don't want the same thing in Canada. We don't want this. What we need is basic freedom, less government. That's our nature. Human nature is always supposed to be under reasonable freedom. We need to get to a world where governments are only there to support our economic and political freedoms. We don't need them to raise armies. We don't need national borders. And the reason we don't need all these rules, borders, is because everything will eventually end up equalizing itself. If you guys think that if you don't have borders, you'll be filled with certain countries will have too many people, that might happen for temporarily, but the way things, the way nature works is that's all going to equalize itself. If you have more people in one town, then you're gonna have higher prices, and a lot of those people will leave that town. It's the same thing with a country. If you have a lot of people going to some country, then you will have higher prices and a lot of lower wages, because labor will supply will go up, and then those people will leave their country. Everything will equalize as long as we operate with free market capitalism rules and not try to hamper natural free market and human freedom with silly government rules and monopolies. And that's what we exactly have in Canada right now. That's why house prices are so high, because land is controlled by the city, which is a corporation, and it just tries to make money out of land sales. That same corporation is the one that's taxing you when you buy a house in that city. So it's taxing you property tax based on its own valuation of your property. So do you see how you become a slave to that entity? Do you see how we have become a slave to corporate entities? And we're having increasingly less and less freedom as we go on. They're bringing more and more wars, and they're making us fight against each other. But you have to realize every war, specifically since 1900s, has been constructed by certain powers to keep us in check. Every time they bring a war, they do something. World War II, they installed the dollar system. World War I, they brought the League of Nations, United Nations, now central government, Federal Reserve, etc. Every time there is some type of false flag, war, terrorist attack, or some type of operation they do, there is some type of rules and laws they bring in. We're under immense danger right now. Humanity is under danger to lose its freedoms, economic and political, and we're gonna be enslaved like drones, living in quarters that we don't even own anymore, because we will lose even the property rights that we have today.